I'm going to start with a really sincere apology for not being there in person. I had been really looking forward to getting over and doing not just my own presentation, but some of the other great things that are happening as part of the Imagine Belfast Festival. And I'm going to single out two of them in particular because it's already day 5 of a 7-day event. I would have really loved to have gone to the politics quiz this evening, which sounds like it's going to be a heck of a laugh. And I also would have really loved to go to my old friend Amanda Verlac's play, This Shit Happens All the Time, which is on at the Lyric Theatre, about the experience of the LGBT community in Northern Ireland, which I think would have been really very useful and educational. So those of you who are in Belfast, I hope that you're able to go to the pub quiz this evening. I hope you've already been to the play in the Lyric Theatre, or that if you haven't, that you're planning to go. For myself, this is a presentation in 2 parts. One of them, I'm going to look at the likely potential outcomes of the Assembly election, which is happening in May. And in the other part, I'm looking at equivalent situations around the world where people have voted on whether they wanted to stay part of the country that they were already in or join a new and different country. And the results are slightly surprising and interesting in the historical context. My name is Nicholas Whyte. I'm here because I'm a visiting professor at Ulster University. That's my email address. Feel free to email me. My apologies to Brendan, if he's here, who wrote me a long email about the subject of this earlier this week, and I haven't had time to reply. My Twitter handle is nwbrooks. Feel free to follow me there as well. I post mainly about science fiction, but I also post about Northern Irish politics quite a lot. To start off with, I thought let's look at what happened in the last Assembly election in 2017. The DUP won. They were the largest single party. They won 28 seats out of 90. With just over 28% of the vote. Sinn Féin were just behind them with 27 seats and just under 28% of the vote. Unionists as a whole won 40 seats with 46%, and Nationalists won 39 seats with 41%. And those who were neither Unionists nor Nationalists, which is Alliance, Greens, and the People Before Politics, won a total of 11 seats with 13% of the vote. The vote totals for Unionists and Nationalists aren't quite the same as what you get if you add up the numbers from the graph on the right. That's because there are smaller parties included. So the question is this going to be a year of change? To answer that question, I'm going to go through the 18 constituencies, each of which elects 5 members of the Assembly. And I'm going through them roughly in order from the most Unionist to the most Nationalist, based on the results of the last few elections, and looking at the potential for change in each one. So that means starting with Nagan Valley, which is the home constituency of the outgoing First Minister, Paul Givan, and of the leader of the largest party, the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donson. And as you can, what I've done in each case is I'm giving you the results of the 2017 Assembly election and any changes that have happened since. Edwin Poots was very recently replaced by Paul Rankin as one of the MLAs. Trevor Lunn, who was elected as Alliance, has left the party and now sits as an independent. I'm also in each case giving you what happened on the last count in each seat. So in Nagan Valley, the SDLP narrowly squeezed in ahead of the third DUP candidate, even though there were 4 quotas of Unionist votes at first preferences. And it's because the SDLP got a lot of transfers from the Ulster Unionists in 2017. Then for each seat, I'm giving you what happened in the Westminster election in 2019 compared to the June 2017 Westminster election. And in Nagan Valley, there was a very strong swing from the DUP to Alliance. And then finally, for each seat, I'm giving you my speculation as to what might happen this year. And it's pretty clear, Nagan Valley was one of the seats where the SDLP were lucky and transfers went the right way. And on paper, their seat is the most vulnerable, and the most likely to pick it up would be the Alliance party, whose vote seems to be increasing. One could see a scenario where that seat went to the Unionists, and that would be a shift, obviously, across the columns from Nationalist to Unionist. So that's 1 out of 18, 17 more to go. Most of them I'll be a bit quicker than that. North Down is a very interesting constituency. It's the most volatile constituency in Northern Ireland. 4 out of 5 of those elected in 2017 are not going into the next election in the same way. Alex Easton has resigned from the DUP. Gordon Dunn passed away and was replaced by his son, Stephen Dunn. Stephen Farry was elected to Westminster and was replaced by Andrew Muir. And Stephen Agnew left politics and is replaced by Rachel Woods. And only Alan Chambers continues as the Ulster with the Ulster Unionists, which is ironic because he only joined them quite recently. In the election, the Greens got the last seat comfortably ahead of the second Ulster Unionist candidate. In the Westminster election, of course, Stephen Farry won with a very large swing from Sylvia Herman. On the basis of that and on the basis of a strong local election performance, one would have to say that Alliance is quite likely to gain a second seat. It's quite difficult to see which of the other parties that could be from. One can make a case for all 3 of them. I guess my gut feeling is that the DUP are the most vulnerable, because I understand that Alex Easton plans to stand as an independent, and he must indeed have a chance of retaining his seat. North Down has a history of voting for independence, which would effectively also be a loss for the DUP. And that, again, in the tally of DUP versus Sinn Féin, who becomes the largest party, that becomes important too. Strangford, next door to North Down, the DUP had a very good result in 2017, winning 3 seats out of 5 on considerably less than half of the vote. I think I understand that even the DUP think this is not likely to be repeated. If they do lose a seat, the SDLP have been runners-up in every assembly election in Strangford since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. One has to think that it's going to be their year sometime. Maybe it's this year, maybe it's not. If the SDLP do win, then that's a seat that goes from the Unionist to the Nationalist column. Alliance are also quite well placed, and if their Westminster election strength continues, then a second Alliance seat would look quite plausible. I don't see a second Ulster Unionist seat there. East Antrim, both Unionist parties have 2 seats at the moment. There's barely 2 Unionist quotas. This is a constituency that's thrown up funny results in the past, with both the SDLP and Sinn Féin winning previously from very low bases. So it could happen. I would have thought more likely that Alliance takes one of the Unionist seats, but by no means certain. It requires good balancing from the Alliance candidates. Ulster Unionists could be in a position to challenge, but more interestingly, this is the likeliest gain for Jim Allister's TUV in the election, a traditional Unionist voice. He himself, of course, sits in neighbouring North Antrim, and he has a number of councillors in the East Antrim area. So one would have to think that if he gets a second seat anywhere, it's going to be here. Of course, he hopes to win more than 2 seats, but I'm just saying if there is one other area where he might win, it's certainly East Antrim should be top of that list. East Belfast, while we're in the East, constituency of the Alliance leader, Naomi Long. I actually think that there's unlikely to be much change here. There are clearly 2 DUP seats. There clearly isn't a third. There are clearly 2 Alliance seats. There clearly isn't a third. The Ulster Unionists look the most vulnerable, but at the same time, nobody looks in a strong position to challenge them. There is quite a strong nationalist vote, particularly for the SDLP at local government elections. So, I'm not saying it's certain, and SDLP gain could come from any of the sitting 3 parties. But as I say, I think this is one where the status quo is the most likely outcome. North Antrim, home of the TUV leader, Jim Allister, and of the Ulster Unionist Minister for Health, Robin Swan. The last seat in 2017 was a contest between the second and third DUP candidates. Ulster Unionists pulled back quite strongly in the Westminster election, but from quite a low base. Alliance hope that they might make a gain here. It's slightly difficult to see who from. Unionists still have pretty much 4 quotas. At the same time, good luck for Alliance and bad luck for the DUP. One could see a change. Still, I tend to think that 2 DUP seats is slightly below where they should be, and more likely than not, we don't see a change here. Neighbouring South Antrim, again, very similar story. The last seat was between the 2nd and 3rd DUP candidates. The difference is the Ulster Unionists are much stronger here. And I would have thought a good year for the Ulster Unionists is kind of defined by, can they beat the DUP in South Antrim? Upper Bann, my own homeland is Lough Brickland, which is the southernmost tip of Upper Bann there. This was a weird one in the last election where Sinn Féin should have won 2 seats, but the SDLP got transfers from Alliance and from the Ulster Unionists. It's not clear that the SDLP will have a strong enough support base to benefit from that this year. They're certainly in the zone, though. Likewise, the DUP are in the zone where they could conceivably lose one of their 2 seats, but the question is to whom. I think Alliance are building towards a gain. Sinn Féin are also building towards a gain. At the same time, the status quo is often the most likely outcome. I think that's the case here. East Londonderry is another place where the Alliance Party thinks it's got a strong chance of a gain. I wonder whether a lot of Alliance voters are already voting for Claire Sugden, the independent unionist MLA in East Londonderry, and whether they're going to change their minds this time. It seems to me that the DUP are pretty comfortably on their 2 quotas. It seems to me that Claire Sugden has been comfortably on her 1 quota, and I don't see a change on the nationalist side either, and I don't see that really offers Alliance an opening, but I may be wrong. We'll see. Now onto the more nationalist half of the table. North Belfast, where I was a candidate myself in 1996 and got a glorious 4% of the vote. I should feel grateful to the 96% of voters who liberated me to follow my subsequent career. I still feel more grateful to the 4% who did vote for me in 1996. The Alliance Party did much better in 2017 than I had done 20 years before. Sinn Féin got the last seat, but only quite narrowly ahead of the Alliance Party. Since then, it would be fair to say that the Alliance support held up, even in the very polarised Westminster election, which saw John Finucane narrowly beat, of Sinn Féin narrowly beating Nigel Dodds of the DUP. It's difficult to see a 3rd unionist seat here. It's not totally clear that there's a 3rd nationalist seat here either. So it could well be Alliance's year in North Belfast. It's also difficult to see the DUP losing one of their 2 seats. So that's my sort of sense of where this one's going. Fermanagh and South Tyrone, always very, very, very tight. Sinn Féin were very lucky to get the 3rd seat here in 2017. The SDLP were very unlucky to be eliminated by a margin of only 62 votes on the 2nd count. And a slightly better day for the SDLP and or less good day for Sinn Féin would be a different matter. So I think a change on the unionist side would be surprising. The DUP and Ulster Unionists seem to be reasonably well balanced. A change on the nationalist side would not be surprising at all. This was a seat that the SDLP were unlucky to have lost. And that, of course, would take Sinn Féin down a notch in terms of their one-on-one contest with the DUP. South Belfast, which is where I grew up, and I find this impossible to read. There is nowhere else where all 5 members of the Assembly are from 5 different parties. There have been 3 changes of personnel. Most recently, of course, very, very sadly, the unexpected death of Christopher Stolford created space for Edwin Poots to move across. Will Edwin Poots be able to motivate the DUP base in a constituency where he's not historically been very strong? Interesting question. Will the Greens hang on to a seat that they won really by the skin of their teeth last time? if they lost it, who would it be to? I think DUP Alliance and SDLP could all hope to be gaining from the Greens. At the same time, I'm sure the Greens will argue that their local support is holding up strongly. We'll find out in May. The interesting thing is that the Ulster Unionist Party, who held this seat pretty much continually for 83 years, apart from when Robert Bradford won for Vanguard, but he later joined the Ulster Unionists, but they got less than 3% in the last Westminster election here, which I think shows people complain about how Northern Irish politics doesn't change. It does. The next three seats are all actually quite similar. West Tyrone, 3 Sinn Féin, 1 SDLP, 1 DUP. Very, very tight. Just about 4 nationalist quotas at the last Assembly election. Just under 2 Unionist quotas. Bad balancing or just bad luck could make that a different story. I tend to think, again, the status quo is the most likely, but it's by no means certain here. Newry and Armagh, very similar story, 3 Sinn Féin, 1 SDLP, 1 DUP. Ulster Unionists a bit stronger here than in West Tyrone, so one could see a potential change of personnel on the Unionist side. Again, on a good year for Unionists, one could see the potential for a gain. Will it be a good year for Unionists? And again, similarly, Mid-Ulster, where once again you have 3 Sinn Féin, 1 SDLP, 1 DUP, and the Unionists narrowly losing out on the last seat. Again, if they were to lose out, if there were to be a change, it would be Sinn Féin losing to a Unionist, but it's difficult to tell. All 3 of those seats were held by Unionists at Westminster level in this century. Southdown is a slightly different matter. Here, the second Unionist seat seems to be very far away. Indeed, the Alliance Party is growing in strength. And the question is, will Alliance be able to find a full quota of votes? And if they do, which of the sitting parties will be the losers? It's very, very tightly balanced. Second last, Foyle, which has been quite volatile. The Westminster election in 2017 saw a narrow gain for Sinn Féin from the SDLP. The 2019 Westminster election saw the SDLP regaining the seat by quite a thumping majority. In 2017, the DUP got the last seat just ahead of Eamon McCann's People Before Profit. On paper, the Unionist vote seems to be slipping still further. One would have thought the SDLP must have a chance of taking a seat off the DUP, which obviously affects the overall balance between Nationalists and Unionists, and also the horse race between the DUP and Sinn Féin. I also hear that the Ulster Unionists are talking up their chances here. Sinn Féin's internal issues have been very well documented. It's rather difficult to see them making a gain, and indeed there must be a possibility that they could even slip back to 1 seat out of 5, which would create an opening perhaps for People Before Profit to return to the Assembly here, which would double their representation, because I think their seat in West Belfast is absolutely solid. Sinn Féin have got 4 seats out of 5 here, which is also pretty solid. It's unusual in a proportional representation election. And I tend to think that there's not likely to be a change here. If there is, one could see the Unionists kind of clawing back if they were very, very lucky and it was a good year. As I said before, it's not clear that this is going to be a good year for Unionists. So the big question is, will Nationalists beat Unionists in the overall vote? And at the start, I presented the 2017 numbers on their own in isolation. Now I'm giving you the historical results of the 6 previous Assembly elections since the Good Friday Agreement. And you can see that if you just take 2017 and compare it with 2016, there's a very attractive narrative that the Nationalist vote soared by over 4% in just 1 year, and the Unionist vote fell by almost the same amount in the course of a single year. And Nationalist seats climbed to within 1 of the Unionists. If you look at the wider historical context, the message is a lot less clear. Nationalist percentage was actually higher in both the 2007 and 2011 elections than it was in 2017. The Unionist vote was a historical low, but is this a sudden dip, or is it a coherent slide? It looks more to me like a sudden dip from a natural position in the higher 40s percentage-wise. And also in terms of the number of seats, we must remember that Nationalists won a lot of their seats by quite slim margins, and Unionists won quite a lot of those last seats by more comfortable margins, which indicates to me that Unionists have got a bit more slippage space than the Nationalists do. So, the question is, was 2017 just a bad year for Unionists, which followed a bad year for Nationalists in 2016? I tend to think that it probably was. Why should 2022 be any better or worse for either? Which then leads to the other question, will Sinn Féin be the largest single party? This is important because the largest party in the new assembly chooses the First Minister, and the Deputy First Minister is chosen either by the largest party of the second biggest designation, or if the largest party is from the smaller designation, then from the largest party of the largest designation. So in other words, if the largest party is Sinn Féin, but there are fewer nationalists than unionists, Sinn Féin gets to choose the First Minister and the DUP get to choose the Deputy First Minister. This was invented to try and boost support around single bigger parties. Polling, for what it's worth, shows that both the DUP and Sinn Féin are getting fewer votes than they did in 2017, but that the DUP are down more. So I have to say my assumption is that Sinn Féin will be the largest party and will have the right to appoint the new First Minister. However, the DUP are still better at getting transfers from Sinn Féin, and this is especially going to be the case if smaller unionist parties like TUV have a lot of candidates who float around under half a quota and get eliminated early, and those votes then return to the unionist family, as it were. On the other hand, the DUP are vulnerable in more constituencies than Sinn Féin are, although both of them have problems. One has to ask whether it really matters. I mean, does it actually make a difference who has the title of First Minister and who is Deputy First Minister? I guess the answer is that the people most concerned think it matters, and that's enough to make sure that it does. So that's my sort of quick presentation on the Assembly election. I want to have a look at whether this would mean a border poll. The rules for that are that the Secretary of State has freedom to call a referendum on whether Northern Ireland joins the Republic at any time, but in particular must do so if it seems that there's likely to be a majority of votes for United Ireland. A few years ago, I expressed the view, which I still have, that if nationalists are ahead of unionists in vote share, or total number of seats in an Assembly election, that's the trigger which would provoke the Secretary of State to call the border poll. Raymond McCord, of course, took a case to the High Court on this, and the court ruled in somewhat verbose terms that it is a political matter and should not be set in legislation, and I think that's right. So then I'm sorry this has disappeared slightly, but even if the DUP are smaller than Sinn Féin as a party, I think unionists are still going to be the biggest single party. I think that Alliance and other centre parties could take seats from nationalists as well as unionists. And I think that my proposed trigger is not going to be set off this year. But I thought it could be useful to have a quick look at other border polls around the world. And by this, I mean referendums and plebiscites. And those two words mean pretty much the same thing, where voters got to choose which larger country they wanted to be ruled by, and independence was not one of the options on the ballot, and the vote was internationally recognized. Most votes on your constitutional status do include independence as an option, and I was actually involved with the most recent two, which were South Sudan and Montenegro. Sometimes people vote against independence. Newfoundland did in 1948 and voted to join Canada. Singapore did in 1962 and voted to join Malaysia, although they quite quickly left again. So the fact that you have a independence referendum doesn't mean that independence is necessarily a consequence. And the same is true of a status vote, of a border poll. Some people have asked me whether Cyprus counts in this categorization. I mean, it's tempting because it was the 2004 referendums in both parts of Cyprus were on creating a united island in the European Union. So you can see why people like the parallel. Turkish Cypriots voted for the plan, but the Greek Cypriots voted against, so it was never implemented. I think there's a couple of key differences with Ireland, which one of them is that both sides argued that there was no real change of sovereignty involved. And the other one is that both sides voted on exactly the same question on the same day. And I think that wouldn't happen in the Irish case. I think we would have a vote in Northern Ireland followed by a vote in the Republic, and the vote in the Republic would be on a different issue. So the historical precedents for border poll, the earliest one I found was way back in 1527, when the people of Burgundy, and when I say the people, I think I mean male heads of household, were asked whether they wanted to stay in France or to join Spain, as a recent international treaty had said that they should. They voted stay in France. Historical details seem a bit murky on this. The next one that I found was in the context of the Italian Risorgimento. As many of you will be aware, Italy became a united country through a series of annexations, most of them ratified by referendum between 1848 and 1870. One of the elements in this process was that France said that it would only recognize the new Italian state if it got something in return. So Nice and Savoy, which had been up until then part of the Kingdom of Piedmont, were given by Piedmont to France, and the result was ratified by a referendum, which I'm sure was totally free and fair. Three interesting cases in the Caribbean. The Danish West Indies in 1868 voted to be ruled by the Americans instead of the Danes. And it turned out the Americans didn't want them. They had the same vote again almost 50 years later, and this time the Americans did want them. So the former Danish West Indies are now the US Virgin Islands. In the neighborhoods, the little island of San Barthélemy, which had been ruled by Sweden, but was mainly French-speaking, voted for French rule by a very large majority in 1877, and still is in the French zone. Two interesting cases in 1919. Vorarlberg is the westernmost province of Austria, voted to join Switzerland in the context of the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I should say. The Swiss didn't want them, so they remained part of Austria. And the same year, the Åland Islands, which is an archipelago between Finland and Sweden, which was politically part of Finland, but the people there feel very Swedish, voted to join Sweden, but were told by the League of Nations that they could not and that they must remain part of Finland. There's no less than, I think, 6 such votes in the year 1920. The disputed region of Schleswig between Germany and Denmark, 3 referendums were planned. Northern Schleswig voted to join Denmark. Central Schleswig voted to stay in Germany, and they cancelled the vote in southern Schleswig because it was obviously going to stay in Germany too. The dodgiest of these was, I'm afraid, my own adopted country of Belgium, where the towns of Eupen and Malmedy were given a referendum on whether to remain in Germany or to be annexed by Belgium. The vote was not a secret ballot. It was carried out in public. Mysteriously, very few of the citizens expressed their desire to remain in Germany, and it was annexed by Belgium, and they remain Belgian. East Prussia, way over on the border between Germany and Poland, voted to stay in Germany by a large majority. Southern Carinthia, which was disputed between Austria and Yugoslavia, voted to stay in Austria, even though ethnic Germans or ethnic Austrians, they're whatever the terminology might be, German speakers, are a minority. And because they voted to stay in Austria, the planned referendum in Northern Carinthia was also cancelled. A few more to go through. In 1921, there's two more post-First World War votes. The Sopron district voted to stay in Hungary rather than to join Austria. This was a case where the town of Sopron voted very strongly to stay in Hungary, but the surrounding villages voted to join Austria, and there were fewer villagers than townspeople, so they stayed in Hungary. Upper Silesia was split between Germany and Poland with a very narrow vote. A few years later, the Saarland, which had been run as a League of Nations protectorate, was offered the choice of staying that way or joining Germany or joining France, and there was a very strong vote to join Germany, which they therefore did. In the context of the partition of India in 1947, there were two referendums. One of them was the Northwest Frontier Province, which is in the northwest of what's now Pakistan. It would have been very weird geographically if they had voted to join India, and indeed they voted to join Pakistan by a large margin. The other one's the Sylhet district between India and Pakistan, but this is East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh. And the result was a territorial split. The vote was 71% to join East Pakistan and 29% to join India. In 1961, the British Cameroons territory was given a choice between joining Nigeria and the former French Cameroons. And again, the territory was split. The Muslim North joined Nigeria and the Christian South joined Cameroon, although I believe they're now regretting it, but it's a bit late. And finally, Gibraltar was offered the opportunity to join Spain in 1967, but voted by a large majority to stay British. Gibraltar had another referendum in 2003, but that was purely on the question of joint sovereignty, and it was not officially recognised. It was a vote to reject proposals that had not been made. So there has been only one border poll anywhere in the world in the last 50 years, and it was on the 8th of March, 1973 in Northern Ireland. And the result was, I'm sorry, my table has gone a bit askew here. Do you want Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom? Almost 99% of valid votes cast supported that option, with a very, very few voting against and slightly fewer that were spoiled. Very large level of abstention. And I'm afraid the figures are obscured, but just to give them to you, of the total electorate, 57.5% voted to remain in the UK, 41.3% did not vote. And nationalist parties were calling for a boycott of the vote by nationalist voters, and they largely got it. Still, the vote for Northern Ireland to stay in the UK was significantly higher than the vote for Unionists and indeed Alliance combined in the Assembly elections and local government elections, which followed later that year. So that tells me that there were a lot of people, maybe even as many as 50,000, who were prepared to vote for Northern Ireland to remain in the UK, but weren't prepared to vote for any party that actually supported that when it came to an actual election, which suggests to me that in 1973, at least, the latent support for the Union was a lot higher than the actual support for Unionism. As for the future, I think the next border poll is going to be a lot closer than that. So I'll conclude there. Thank you very much for listening to me. And if we can maybe break out into, I'll stop sharing the screen, and maybe we can break out into Q&A. And I'm very pleased to have got 26 participants, and I'm ready for your questions. And I wonder if I'm going to seek guidance from our hosts here. Is it better to do the raise hand thing, or should we just invite people to unmute and ask?
We can invite them on. I've allowed them to unmute at the
I think you all look well behaved. Yeah, let's. If you wish to ask a question, please unmute and speak. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Nicholas.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, Ben Collins. Sorry,
Ben,
you
good
can't,
to see you.
you can't
Yeah.
be here in Belfast. Do you think I didn't realize there were so many border polls over the last decade. Sorry, over the last century. Do you think, are there any learnings we can take from the Brexit referendum?
Well, of course, the key learning is not to have a referendum on something that's really complicated. But yeah, I mean, to me, the single thing that I think is the most important learning from that is to make sure that people are satisfied with the question of who gets to vote. And as you recall, with the Brexit referendum, there were serious questions about excluding expats from the electoral register. And also there was a push for the referendum to include 16 and 17-year-olds, given that it's their future that's being discussed as well. So I think in the event of a border poll, those questions should be asked and resolved. I don't have an immediate answer to either of them. I can see quite a strong case for saying that the voters in the referendum should be the same as the voters for an assembly election, but I think this is something that should be discussed and resolved in a political way rather than in a accidental way, which I think was the case with the Brexit referendum.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Michael, I think.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay, Nicholas?
I hear you fine, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. With so many new candidates from the DUP side, how strong do you think the personality aspect will be? I notice here in Upper Band, Johnny Buckley has taken more PR almost than Diane Dodds in the last wee while. It's almost as they're trying to front him up as make him better known in the area.
Yeah, I mean, you know, having been a candidate and election organizer myself, you never know how much of the election result is due to the level of knowledge of the candidate in the area and how much is just due to the wider success of the party message. You have to throw everything, including the kitchen sink, into these campaigns. And if you think you have a candidate who's capable of winning an extra seat, then of course you promote them. Now, this in a single transferable vote election, this can lead to quite strong internal party rivalries. And certainly I've seen cases where you know, the territory of the constituency is divided up between two or more candidates, and there is misbehavior within the party of people leafleting in other people's agreed territory, which is all very entertaining. But to me, as a student of these things and as a Democrat, I think anything that makes political parties try harder to get votes from voters is a good thing.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, Desi.
Hi, Nicholas. How's it going? Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine.
No problem. So just a quick question. In the situation where Alliance were to become the second most voted party, what would happen to the position of Deputy First Minister?
Right. So the position of First Minister goes to the biggest single party, right? So if Alliance is the biggest party, then they get First Minister, no question about it. The position of Deputy First Minister goes to the biggest party in whichever of the two biggest designations has not already got First Minister. So the bar is slightly different. So one could see a situation where the middle ground are kind of laying third into, you know, the Unionists and Nationalists, the top two designations, and the centre ground is in third place. But through some quirk, Alliance ends up as the biggest single political party. And then the Deputy First Minister position goes to whichever of Unionists and Nationalists is the largest and whichever is the largest faction within that. So what this means is that for Alliance to get the First Minister position, in some ways, paradoxically, is actually easier than getting Deputy First Minister. Because to be First Minister, all you need is to be the biggest single political party. To be Deputy First Minister, you need to be lucky and be the largest party within whichever of the top two groups hasn't yet got something. This is all hypothetical because I think the top two parties this year are very likely to still be the DUP and Sinn Féin. But I think these are the questions we need to be asking about the future, and you know, politicians need to ask themselves if they're satisfied with that as a just outcome, and not just politicians, but voters as well.
Thank you.
Jack, go ahead.
Thanks, Nicholas, and thanks so much for a great presentation. It's been very interesting. I just want to ask, I suppose, about transfers, because that's what I'm particularly interested in this election, because it's actually my PhD topics. I've been looking at all the previous elections in the context of transfers and the sort of extent to which, we've seen greater transfers from unionism to nationalism and vice versa, because I think that was obviously the most interesting factor of the last Assembly election, the UUP to SDLP transfers and vice versa. But I was wondering in particular how you feel about the extent to which that will continue, particularly in the context of Alliance being much more competitive in, pretty much every constituency, and the extent to which they might take a lot of those transfers that may otherwise go, UUP to SDLP and vice versa.
Yeah, I agree with you that is really, really interesting. And I also agree with you that we just don't know. This is one of the things that doesn't come through from opinion polling at all. It's very difficult to ask people which way their transfers are going to go, and then it's even more difficult to transfer those to convert those polling responses into anything resembling real data. I have to say my gut feeling would be that last time around there was a very concerted and definite campaign from Colm Eastwood and Mike Nesbitt for their supporters to transfer to each other, and that was what helped the SDLP to win a couple more of those marginal seats. It didn't do the Ulster Unionists as much good. I have not seen indications that they're going to be pursuing the same approach this year. So that tends to mean that I think it's going to be less of a factor this year, and that we'll see more internal transfers between the two blocks. But you make the very good point that the centre ground vote is likely to be much bigger this year than it has been previously, and the centre ground parties tend to be much better at pulling in transfers from both sides, which may mean that that in the end they punch above their weight due to getting more support in the final stages. It's part of the greatness of the single transferable vote as an electoral system. Every country should use it. Very few do.
Yep, definitely. Thanks very much.
Sure. Jean, I see you next. But I think you're mute. You're muted.
Am I muted?
Not anymore.
Okay, right. I must have pressed the right button. Thank you for your fascinating detail about all the constituencies. It's clear that some of them are likely to undergo quite a lot of change because of the change in personnel and various other issues that are cropping up. But thinking about American presidential elections where they identify swing states, at an early stage, can you identify swing constituencies where you expect, which are going to maybe shape the whole thing?
Yeah, I would say definitely the three in the West, West Tyrone, Mid Ulster, and Fermanagh, South Tyrone. Those are the three where the Unionist Nationalist race is particularly close. And I remember before the 2017 election, a friend of mine who's well known to all of you, I think, but I won't name, but he's prominent in the DUP. And he said to me that he honestly expected that Nationalists would take 4 seats out of 5 in each of those 3 constituencies. And I thought this was incredibly pessimistic on his side, and it turned out that he was absolutely right. Now, like I said, 2017 was an unusually poor year for Unionists. If we see a reversion to the historical average this year, then those 3 constituencies will stay as they were. If we see a continuation of the status quo, then Unionism is in danger. Then Unionism is in danger of becoming the smaller group, and the DUP are certainly in danger of becoming the smaller party to Sinn Féin.
I was also fascinated to hear you say that where we lived in Finnehy was one of the most diverse of all communities.
Yes, that wasn't the case when I was growing up. Sorry for those participants who haven't quite guessed that Jean is my mother.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kate, you were able to join us after all. I saw you were dubious about whether you would have enough signal earlier when we were discussing. So I'm very glad to see you.
Hi. Thanks, Nicholas. I was just wondering, very interesting presentation, obviously, but what are the reasons that you say that 2017 was a bad year for Unionists, and really, have we really seen much of a change? I mean, what are the kind of ABC that says, okay, these are the reasons why that was a bad year this year, maybe not. So it seems to me that we still see fragmentation, we still see, you know, some internecine politics, we still see some not so strong, some stronger personalities. What's different this year that might suggest that it's going back on an even keel, for example?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that, I mean, first of all, my empirical reason for saying that it was a bad year for Unionists is that it was a bad year for Unionists. You know, it was a historically low vote for Unionists. So the question is, was it just a bad year for Unionists, or did it mark a bigger change? And that's something that we will find out on May the 6th. I agree with you. I don't think I've seen very much evidence that Unionist parties have been getting their act together since then, and I certainly would agree that there has been more fragmentation. The question is, does greater fragmentation pull in more voters, or does it repel them? In the 1970s, the greater fragmentation among Unionist parties definitely motivated voters and helped them to turn out and choose between the options. I do get the sense that that's less the case this time, and I have to say I would anticipate that the Unionist vote doesn't change all that much from where it was in 2017, in which case, you know, we're talking about, is it going to be a good year for Unionists or a bad year for Unionists? I think my gut feeling is it's probably going to be a bad year.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
But we'll see what voters actually do. You know,
the only poll that counts is the one on election day,
as we well know. Yeah. Eileen.
Yes, greetings, everyone. Thank you for that analysis. What's on my mind are demographics, meaning there will be a number of younger voters that are voting now that were too young to vote earlier. Mm-hmm. Has there been any analysis of this new group of young voters coming in, and what might that look like?
I mean, every opinion poll breaks down the actual electorate by age group. So there's something to be gained from that. I have to say, I find the broadly older voters are more Unionist and younger voters are less Unionist. I find that the margins are a bit too tight to really be definitive beyond that broader generalization. You know, we're seeing a Northern Ireland where there are as many Catholic kids as Protestant kids. But we're also seeing in Northern Ireland where there's an increasing number of kids who are brought up in neither tradition or with affection for both. And we're seeing in Northern Ireland with a lot more migrants from other parts of the UK, other parts of Ireland, other parts of Europe, other parts of the world. So this is a society which at one point was very, very deeply polarized between two options. And I think the real growth among the younger generation is of those options, is of the number of people who are rejecting both of those options. Many of my own friends from high school in Belfast are in mixed marriages. So their children don't have an automatic allegiance to either side. And I saw a statistic the other day, well, I can't remember the precise number, so I won't give them, but I think anecdotally we'll all be aware that the number of mixed marriages in Northern Ireland is far higher now than it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And that has an impact. So we're seeing a generation coming in that is probably more demanding of their politicians, but also unfortunately a bit less likely to vote. And that then blunts the impact they will have on the political process. One thing you can say about older voters is that they are actually much more likely to actually vote. My mother's aunt is 105 years old and has not missed an election.
That is quite something.
Indeed.
Sorry, if I might say something. I missed the start of your presentation. Apologies for that. I am sitting in South Belfast, and I would be curious if it's not too much trouble, if you could just give me a quick whiz through what your thoughts are on this constituency.
Okay. Well, I did indeed have a slide on South Belfast, which I will try and whiz back to.
You're very kind.
If the technology will allow me. So forgive me, those of you who were their first time round. There we are. Now then, the question is, will I be allowed to share my screen? Because
even if you can't, just whatever you know, if you can, you just.
Here we are. Look. Yep, there you go. So South Belfast, extraordinary, volatile. The only constituency where all 5 MLAs are from different parties. On paper, I would say that's the most likely continuation. The weakest of the 5 is the Green, who got the last seat last time around, and that's not a reflection on the Greens, it's just a statement of fact. They were the last candidate elected last time. Based on the local government election results, the DUP or Alliance could hope to gain that seat. Based on the Westminster election results, the SDLP could say the same. The really interesting thing for me, having grown up there, is that the Ulster Unionists, who held the Westminster seat for over 80 years, are basically nowhere. They got less than 3% in the last election. So yeah, it's not particularly a bellwether in the bigger picture. I mean, if the SDLP win the seat, that's one more for nationalists. If the DUP gain, then it's one more for the DUP and for unionists. If Alliance take the Green seat, then it remains within the centre ground. But an equally likely outcome is that the same parties return, with a significant shift of personnel, of course, because Claire Hanna was elected to Westminster, Martin O'Meara left politics, and Christopher Stolford sadly passed away. So they've all been replaced.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Now, can I stop the share? I'm very grateful to the hosts of this event for helping me out with the technical stuff, which I confess, despite the fact that I actually do this kind of thing for a living, I still find it quite challenging.
Can I ask another question, Nicholas, if it's all right?
You may, Ben.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just in relation to the border pool, I think that's a very interesting analysis of yours, that if nationalists end up with the largest number of votes, not necessarily a majority, but they're bigger than Unionism, and the largest number of seats, that a border pool would be called. I think that makes a lot of sense. But do you think, in the context of the UK government being resistant to a second Scottish independence referendum, does that have a big impact, or do you think it's different because of the Good Friday Agreement?
It is different because of the Good Friday Agreement. And Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK that has the automatic right to join another country as part of the referendum. I'm very friendly with the Scottish nationalists who think that it's exactly the same thing. I hate to point out to them that Scotland actually has a land border with England, which Northern Ireland does not, and I think that I kind of think that's germane, but anyway. But yeah, of course, the current British government is going to be very resistant to any kind of constitutional tinkering, and my friends in the Conservative Party, and amazingly, I still have some, all tell me that they're deeply attached to and passionate about the concept of the union of the 4 countries. At the same time, at heart, they're Democrats, and they do accept that if there's a majority for going a different way, that it's not up to them to hang on to people who want to leave. It's not clear that that enlightened attitude is the view of the current Prime Minister, but then again, one has to wonder just how much longer he's going to be the current Prime Minister.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Can I ask another question as well, if you have time?
Go on ahead, Michael.
Yeah, you didn't give us a final total that we could put in an envelope and open on the 7th. Have you a figure in your head, or you keeping coy about that?
I'm going to keep my powder dry on that one. I think come the BBC coverage, which I'll be participating in on the election day, I will kind of go around the studio and ask everybody to write down their numbers, including myself, and we may do a wee sweepstake on it. But I think right now I want to sense a little bit more of how the campaign is going. And events can happen. Campaigns do make a difference. I think that the Mike Nesbitt, Colm Eastwood double act last time did shift votes and did shift the outcome in a number of seats. And people can choose whether or not to do that. In general, Northern Irish parties are very bad at campaigning. And I say that as somebody who's observed election campaigns in a number of different countries.
Is there anything we should watch out that morning when the starting tally say, hey, that's interesting? Or, you know, is there something you say, wow?
Well, as I said to my mother earlier, the three Western constituencies, I think, are the key. The West Tyrone, Mid Ulster, and Fermanagh and South Tyrone. And I think because of their geographical shape, they tend to be relatively late coming in. But they're the ones I'll be watching with the most interest, because I think that's where it turns.
And finally, you've sort of not mentioned the Jim Allister effect. Has he an effect outside his own area?
He has two effects. One of them is that he will erode the DUP, because they're the party that loses out most from, you know, they're the party whose voters he is targeting most. And the second effect is that, of course, it's in a sense it's invisible unionist votes, because I think a lot of the TUV votes will go to candidates who don't get elected, and they will therefore boost the unionist vote tally without necessarily boosting the number of unionist seats. I see the Goulds next, but I'm not sure which of you has the hand up. And you're muted.
Sorry, David Gould. It's really, this is a very interesting discussion from all our points of view, leading to something which might be a big change, which could create other problems. And I'm really looking for an opinion on, if we go through all this democracy and we end up with the Sinn Féin becoming leader, and we get the DUP walking out, what good was having the election?
Indeed. And I think the question that needs to be asked of all politicians going into an election is, are you going to accept the outcome? Are you actually prepared to accept the will of the voters? If you're a Democrat, you should be able to answer that question in the affirmative. And I would like to see people putting that question to all candidates in the forthcoming election. I think I think if you're not going to accept the result of the election, you shouldn't really be participating in it in the first place. But I can understand why people make tactical decisions in a different direction, but I think the integrity of the process is very important, and keeping people's faith in the process is very important. So I think that's a very good point. Rosanna, you've come back to me, and I think this probably should be the last one, because we're at the top of the hour, but I mean, I'll be flexible if people have got something else they burningly want to say. But Rosanna, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. You said that we are very bad at campaigning here. Yep. Why is that?
Sorry, why do I say that, or why do I think we're bad at campaigning?
Yeah.
I mean, I say it because I've compared with. I think that in Northern Ireland, political parties are very bad at establishing a connection between voting for me and changing your life. And in the end, that is the only reason that a voter has to support a political party, is because of the impact it will have on their own life. And there is not really that culture of accountability in Northern Irish politics. Irish politics in general, and this goes back to the time of Daniel O'Connell, who invented the modern political party back in the early 19th century. I mean, all democratic society political parties basically have their roots in Daniel O'Connell's movement, because it was the first sort of mass membership political body, which also existed to fight election campaigns and for patronage opportunities for those who were active in it, which to me are the characteristics of any political party anywhere, even in non-democratic societies. But Irish politics in general has a history of combining community identity and clientelism, providing service to voters. But on top of that, those are two quite important aspects. But I think today's voters are becoming more demanding, and they want to know what difference you, the candidate, are going to make to their life. And I don't think politicians in Northern Ireland have really caught up with that. Someday somebody will, and I see some parties being better at this than others, but I'm not going to name them right now. And I think those that do manage to find the way of combining those issues are going to be more successful.
Very much indeed.
Does anybody else have anything burning? Well, I beg your pardon. Comment in from Yvonne Blythe, who says that far from being servants of the people, Northern Ireland politics uses we the people as collateral, and the parties play their own games between each other and just bother with us come election time. I mean, you know, that's a point of view. I would say that the politicians who I know really believe in this stuff. They're not in it for a quick buck. I mean, any politician who you know could actually be making more money in the private sector, or even you know in the public sector, frankly. So they're not doing it out of sheer love out of sheer greed. And almost every politician I have met, not all of them, but almost every politician I've met does have a strong concept of public service. But I think it's poorly articulated and it's poorly developed. And I think people deserve a little bit better, and I think they're entitled to ask for more. And Ben Collins asks, if I started the rumor about Hugh Grant being the new Doctor Who, and clearly I cannot possibly comment on that. But thank you all very much. You've been lovely. And I look forward, I wish I was there in person. I wish I'd been able to do this with you properly rather than in Brussels. It is Friday evening here, so it's already beer o'clock. I'm an hour ahead of you guys. But I wish you all a good evening. If you can go to the Politics Pub quiz later on, please do. And if you can see Amanda's play in the Lyric, please do that as well. And do lots of really fun things. And vote, 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 come May, those of you who are in the jurisdiction, which isn't everybody I know. Thank you.